neoliberalism as the political economy, the actual system of political and economic practice and power. What's wrong intellectually with many of the ideas that underlie neoliberalism? The ideology of neoliberalism. Too much attention has been paid to that, and too little attention has been paid to what actually has happened, right, in the neoliberal era from 1980 to the present, although the last 15 years are more the crisis of neoliberalism. What has happened is not the same thing as what they say. And it's particularly not the same thing if you think about the history of neoliberalism as a global phenomenon. Neoliberalism looks very different and operates very differently in the places in which it has concentrated power and wealth: New York, London, Hong Kong, Dubai, Shanghai, than the places in which the hammer falls, right? The north of England, Lille in France, West Virginia in the United States, the Niger Delta in Nigeria, a whole bunch of different places in China, too numerous to list. And so we need to understand neoliberalism as a global system of open and closed societies working together to create a single global political economy. I'm going to say this over and over again so it's not missed. Right? The nature of the Chinese state, the nature of the Nigerian state, the nature of the Saudi Arabian state is as fundamental to what neoliberalism is as the English state, the Australian state, the United States, Canada, France, Germany. And the outcome, the end game of this system, looked at globally, is the weakening of public power and the suborning of public power to private power. The two theses of these lectures are: one, neoliberalism cannot be understood other than as a global system. Two, the output, the end game, it's not freedom, it's not wealth, it's power. It's private power. I hope people recognize what the image behind this slide is. Right? That's Elon Musk's star rocket that blew up last week. Right? The world's richest man undertaking, using essentially privatized public assets, a function that was at the heart of the legitimacy and majesty of the American state in the pre-neoliberal era. Now, where does this begin? Neoliberalism as a political economy and as a global order begins not in the City of London, not in New York, not at the University of Chicago, although that's close. It begins in Santiago, Chile. In 1970, Keynesian economics and social democratic politics were near hegemonic outside of the communist world, where arguably an even more left-wing economic order was hegemonic. In what was called the free world at the time, as I said, what would now be considered rather left-wing political economy was dominant. The one way of understanding this dominance is that even right-wing governments and US-backed military dictatorships, like those in Brazil and Argentina at the time, pursued authoritarian versions of these same policies. Trade union, for example, in Brazil under military dictatorship, trade unionism was mandatory. Mandatory. That's controversial among trade unionists, but that was the reality of the Brazilian dictatorship, a right-wing dictatorship. For decades prior to this time, a rather small group of economic right-wingers, of people who stuck with classical liberalism through the Depression and through the Second World War. People like Friedrich Hayek, perhaps the most important of this group intellectually, William Buckley in the United States, Milton Friedman at the University of Chicago, and Ayn Rand, who was a very peculiar character with a huge intellectual and social influence. These folks were trying during this period to revive classical economics, to return to market fundamentalism. And they were backed by wealthy families and a few corporations. Most of business had made their peace at this time with the Keynesian order. They were backed by a few right-wing families, wealthy families in the United States and in the United Kingdom, in their effort to create a political movement to fundamentally undo the social democratic consensus. But they did not have the opportunity to apply their ideas of fundamentally, as the American right-wing political activist Grover Norquist said later, to shrink the state to the point where it could be drowned in a bathtub. They didn't have the opportunity to do that until a CIA-backed military coup in Chile in 1973, in the context of the growing crisis of Keynesian economics, the collapse of the Bretton Woods monetary regime, the slowing global economic growth. In that context, the CIA-backed military coup in Chile gave the economic right-wingers an opening. A military government wielding absolute power that was willing to try to undo social democratic structures, not to contain them, not to sort of manage them in a more conservative way, as governments like the Macmillan government in this country or the Eisenhower government in the United States had done, not to kind of compromise with them, but to smash them. A government willing to smash them with absolute power came into being in Chile. And in case this photo doesn't mean anything to you, this is a picture of the meeting of Milton Friedman, right, the leading right-wing US economist of the time, with General Pinochet in Santiago, where this agenda was discussed. Now, you might ask, how can this be? How can market fundamentalism or libertarianism, how can it be associated with military dictatorship? This would seem to be, this is one of the, neoliberalism is filled with paradoxes. This is perhaps one of the most fascinating paradoxes of neoliberalism, is the assertion of absolute human freedom, which yet requires military dictatorship to enable it, to make it happen. And it's important to understand, because this type of logic flows through the neoliberal era, that there is this fundamental connection between economic libertarianism and authoritarianism, and the heavy hammer of the state. The reason why this is true is because market fundamentalism, the idea that quote, free markets, that markets left on their own, never mind co-creation by the state and all that, markets left on their own produce optimum social outcomes. That idea is historically associated with the idea that the right to private property is a fundamental natural right and cannot be interfered with by the state. Now, those are not the same ideas, but they historically have gone together. Not surprisingly, people with property tend to view that property as a natural right, and they also tend to think that being left alone to buy and sell their property is the best of all possible worlds. But when you combine those two beliefs as the center of a conception of public policy or of political economy, then historically what tends to happen is that the result is rising economic inequality, broad economic insecurity, and governments that are unable to effectively manage economic cycles. This was the outcome of the classical liberal order, and it has been the outcome of neoliberalism at various times and various places. In a democracy, or in any kind of political economy in which public opinion is allowed to influence public policy, public opinion will, in response to these economic shortcomings of market fundamentalism, demand policies that impinge on property rights. Right? That is the entire history, by the way, of this society, of the United Kingdom, since the adoption of universal suffrage in the 19th century. Market fundamentalists will, in response to democracy's demand for limitations on private property rights, market fundamentalists who believe in private property as a fundamental right will feel entitled to have the state resort to violence and authoritarianism to preserve their property. Just as you or I might feel that way if our political or religious freedoms were interfered with. We might feel that violence was appropriate in response to an authoritarian threat to our freedom. People who deeply believe in property rights tend to believe that violence is okay if their property rights are threatened. This is the logic that produces Milton Friedman and General Pinochet sitting in the same room together. It's worth remembering that this logic has much more force in societies with deep historic, class, race, or caste divisions, where those with property have deeper reasons to view those without property as fundamentally inferior to themselves, and thus okay targets of violence. This dynamic, this paradox of the association of market fundamentalist or libertarian economic ideas with a propensity to political violence and an authoritarian states is at the core of the neoliberal project and the neoliberal era. And you will see it repeatedly in these presentations. Now, the Chilean, what happened in Chile from an economic policy perspective after the coup was that fundamental social democratic structures were dismantled. Retirement security systems were privatized. Trade unions were made illegal. This turned out not to be sustainable in the long run in Chile, but during the period of high military dictatorship, trade unions were made illegal. Now, this was a precursor to what then happened in the United States and the United Kingdom, the two countries in the world that in the late 70s and early 80s moved decisively in the neoliberal direction. And so the reason why this happened is that throughout the world, the rise of democracy based on universal suffrage was associated with the rise of trade unions. And trade unions were the political power behind the rise of mixed economies in the post-war era, the Keynesian social democratic hegemony I talked about earlier. So in order to fundamentally alter that order and replace it with the neoliberal order, the first thing that strategists saw they needed to do was to break the power of the trade union movement. And if you go and look at what was said by various key actors in both Britain and the United States during this period, they were very explicit about it. Margaret Thatcher, Paul Volcker, in certain respects, even Jimmy Carter, in relation to things like the regulation of transportation in the United States, all expressed a desire to weaken the trade union movement. And they used a variety of tools during this period very effectively. Labor laws that had been put in place in the Depression and the Second World War were fundamentally weakened in both societies. Monetary policy was used to break the bargaining power of workers by bringing in an era of high unemployment after decades of relatively full employment in both societies. This little visual here is interest rates in the United States during the late 70s and early 80s. When those things didn't work, force was used. That's the miners' strike. The key events here that reshaped the balance of power between labor and management and weakened labor as a political force were in the United States, the air traffic controllers strike, where Ronald Reagan fired all the striking air traffic controllers, the News Corp strike in London, which is now kind of forgotten in the wake of the miners' strike, but actually came first, where Rupert Murdoch moved the printing presses out of the center of London and employed non-union workers, and ultimately successfully, and of course the 1984 miners' strike in the United Kingdom. The core ideas of neoliberalism articulated at this time was an attack on the state as a shaper of markets. This comes back again to what we do here at IIPP. In the 1980s, in the United States and the United Kingdom, Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher set the policy tone that would define neoliberalism for decades to come. Policies that were designed to weaken the state as a market-shaping institution and a counterbalance to private power. As Ronald Reagan famously said, the 9 most terrifying words in English language are, "I'm from the government and I'm here to help." If as a master's student in this program, you graduate and you go into government and you walk into an office and you find somebody my age and they say, "We can't do that. That's not government's role. That's not possible," they are echoing this. Right? Margaret Thatcher, "There is no such thing as society. There are individual men and women, and there are families." This is the underlying denial of the notion of social solidarity that underpins any democratic government. It's very important to understand this kind of stuff as profoundly linked to the pictures I showed you before, right, of an effort to use force to break social solidarity. This is the theory. The police on horseback, the tanks in the streets of Santiago, they are the practice. But it did not stop there. Now, again, back to the sort of ironies of neoliberalism. The people that I was just laying out in front of you, Milton Friedman, Friedrich Hayek, Margaret Thatcher, Ronald Reagan, they were making 2 kinds of claims about economics and politics, claims that have echoed through the neoliberal era. They were making a normative claim, and they were making an empirical claim. The normative claim is that neoliberalism is a political economy of freedom, that weakening the state and weakening institutions of social solidarity creates freedom. A world in which power does not exist. The second claim is that market fundamentalism, deregulated markets, privatized capital, is the best we can do from an efficiency perspective. Anything else will make us worse off as a world. Now, I think by the time this lecture and the following one are finished, you may doubt the truth of these statements, but they are the claims of neoliberalism. And as I've said before, they fundamentally undercut the key idea of the entrepreneurial state, that the state itself can be, and in fact must be, a source of creativity and innovation, and that markets are not handed down by God, that markets are actually created and shaped by states. These ideas are fundamentally in conflict. Now, the hegemony of market fundamentalism, the hegemony of the idea that, quote, unregulated markets produce optimal social outcomes, not just its adoption by particular governments, by particular politicians, but its adoption by entire state apparatuses. Right? And this is, I think, Gary Gerstl's book really is very good on this point in terms of the United States. Its adoption by entire state apparatuses destroys the self-confidence and sense of mission of states and their bureaucracies. Our colleague Reiner has just written a book on the importance of effective bureaucracies. The term bureaucracy itself has become kind of an insult. Right? But the reality is that if we want our societies to function, we need effective bureaucracies. Neoliberalism argued for the destruction of bureaucracy, of government institutions, as a positive good. This is the intellectual structure of neoliberalism. But it is not the reality of neoliberalism. The reality of neoliberalism is something quite different. Because it's not about a world without power. It's about shifting power from the public to the private sector, from the public realm to the private realm, from democratic states to corporations, capital markets, and to some degree international institutions that are at a remove from democratic accountability. Now, the neoliberal policy agenda was marketed as freedom from the state, but its consequence was the growth of private power. Private power over markets, private power over workers, over citizens, and ultimately private power over the state itself. Now, I talked for a minute about the attack on the labor movement as the first move in the actual agenda of creating a neoliberal political economy. By the late 70s in Britain, to some degree in the United States, and certainly by the early 80s in the United States, and then increasingly around the world, you saw a set of neoliberal policies pursued in common across national boundaries, but within nation states. Tax cutting, particularly on corporations and the wealthy. Dismantling antitrust enforcement, allowing the accumulation of private market power. Dismantling of financial regulations dating from the era of the Great Depression, and supporting finance capital exerting more power vis-a-vis operating companies. The dismantling of the regulation of the media and the privatization of public media enterprises. This is particularly dramatic in the United States. This is where Fox News comes from, is this change. But it occurred throughout the world and has been a constant battleground in the United Kingdom over the fate of the BBC. And the dismantling of environmental regulation, something which has turned out to have truly horrifying consequences, which was symbolized in the early days of the neoliberal era by President Reagan's removing the solar panels from the White House roof. What was the consequence of these policies? I could show you 100 graphs, but they all basically tell the same story. This is the Gini coefficient of the United Kingdom. Oops, excuse me. This is the Gini coefficient of the United Kingdom. That giant spike there, that spike is Thatcher. This is the graph of a regime change. Right, down here, you see a Gini coefficient of around 3.0. This is basically true since the Second World War. Up here is 4.6. And it's true, as you can see, to the present day. A radical increase in inequality of wealth and power and income, right, that changed very fast with the adoption of neoliberal policies by the Thatcher government and has not been undone since, despite the fact that there was a labor government for some time. Now, by the end of the 1980s, as I was just saying, economic data showed clearly across all of the world's developed countries that we were entering a new regime, a new political economy regime. Different countries entered this regime from different starting points. So if you looked at the data for, say, union density in the United Kingdom and in Sweden, they started very different points. Union density in this country in 1980 was around 30%. In Sweden, it was like 80%. But the trend is downward everywhere. Same thing is true for the size of the state. The characteristics of the regime that came into being during this time was and this is the most important, the public sector shrinking as a percentage of GDP. True across OECD countries, except you have to be careful around defense spending. So that you can see, there's some odd things, particularly with the United States, that are created by defense spending. But if you take that out, you'll see the same thing everywhere. 2, lower corporate tax rates and lower marginal individual tax rates, and lower revenue collection. Declining union density, wage stagnation. A shift from labor income to capital income in terms of the composition of national income. The privatization of public assets. A greater concentration of both financial institutions and operating companies, business in general. Rising inequality of incomes, as I showed on the last slide, and even more so of wealth. To really follow the neoliberal order, you need to follow wealth data more than income data. From the perspective of the agenda of this institution, the IIPP, this slide is one to not forget. This graph is a graph from Thomas Piketty's work, most recent work, a team that Piketty leads, that shows what has happened to the balance of private assets and public assets in major developed economies during the neoliberal era. And as you can see, the top line is the private assets, which go up as a percentage of GDP from 300 to 600 and 700%, while public assets fall, in some cases, below zero. Below zero meaning that public liabilities now exceed public assets. Now this is a measure of the impoverished, this is a way of getting at the impoverishment of the public sector under the neoliberal order and the draining away of state capacity. Now, what I've done so far is to lay out for you neoliberalism as a set of economic ideas and national economic practice. The rest of the talk is going to be about neoliberalism as a global order. And again, there are some ironies here. The rise of governments in the English-speaking world in the 1980s that put neoliberal ideas into practice, and the beginning of the creation of a neoliberal political economy in that period, was actually not initially clearly connected to a new kind of global political economy. The Reagan and Thatcher governments' trade and foreign policies looked backward toward the Cold War and traditional business-oriented protectionism much more than they did forward to the globalism of the 90s. Something many Americans are not aware of is the Reagan administration was actually protectionist, fundamentally, not free trade oriented. The Reagan administration responded to demands from American industrial enterprises in the early 80s to do something about Japan, about South Korea, about countries that were viewed as threats to American business, before American business figured out that outsourcing was an opportunity, not a threat. The same thing, I think, can be understood about the Plaza Accords, by the way, of the currency deal that Reagan cut with Japan. The Falklands War, right, is not a globalist enterprise. Right? The Falklands War was, again, a backward-looking sort of late imperial venture. The hostility to the UN that was evidenced by Reagan and Thatcher, very different than the pro-international institution tilt of governments in both countries later. What changed and what set the stage for the neoliberalism as a global order was the fall of the Soviet Union in 1989. Now that is what most people who've written about neoliberalism will tell you is the key event. And I'm not arguing that it's not. It's very important. But I would suggest that if you think about neoliberalism as a global system, that the real key event is not the fall of the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union, the countries that made up the former Soviet Union, are not at the center of the world's economy today, and were not at the center of the world's economy in the 1990s. The key event, in my view, is the one that is behind these words. It's the failure of the Tiananmen uprising. It's the failure of democratic forces in China to succeed in putting China on a path away from its Leninist heritage. This sets the stage for China playing the role that it does in the 1990s as a provider of cheap labor to the global neoliberal system, and ensures that working people in China are unable to assert their voices during the long period of neoliberal hegemony. And this is the key event that makes the neoliberal global system possible on the scale and with the completeness that it triumphed in the 1990s. So what is the key element? What are the key elements of neoliberalism as a global system? By the way, I should say, I have no idea what would have happened had Tiananmen succeeded. I just know that its failure set the stage for a certain type of relationship between the world's largest economies. Now, what are the key elements of neoliberalism as a global system? First, and this is not original by me, development of truly global systems of natural resource extraction, production, and finance, which integrate developed world democracies and emerging market states with varying degrees of authoritarian governments. This is, again, the paradox of neoliberalism. The assertion that what the neoliberal order is an order characterized by open markets, rule of law, democracy, and the actuality, the reality of what happened during the heyday of the neoliberal order in China, in Mexico, in Russia, in Nigeria, in Saudi Arabia. Ken Saro-Wiwa, executed by the Nigerian government in order to ensure that the people of the Niger Delta did not get their fair share of oil being produced for British Petroleum and Shell, is as much an emblematic figure of the neoliberal order as Bill Clinton or Tony Blair. Second, the rise of tax havens that create a hidden, globally integrated tax system. I'm going to talk about this more later this term in lectures about recent British economic history. But this means that no matter what the intentions of any given government are in relation to their tax rates, wealthy individuals and corporations can always move into the alternative tax system. Ireland, Delaware in the United States, obviously some other places like Luxembourg and the Cayman Islands. But when you start listing the places, most of them seem to be under the British Crown. Third, economic integration through trade agreements without regulatory integration, which essentially, again, defeats national efforts to regulate economies and to impose labor standards, environmental standards, and the like. The WTO becomes that kind of system. Famously, NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement. Interestingly, the EU tried very hard to have social integration as well as economic integration, as well as trade integration, but left out certain key things, like a truly enforceable minimum wage across the nation states of the EU, with disastrous consequences, which I'll talk about in my lecture on Brexit. Fourth, the restructuring of international institutions to be enforcers of private property rights and investor interests against government. The GATT, the WTO, the IMF, the World Bank, and the OECD moved into this role during the 1990s, whereas in the past, at least nominally, most of them were supposed to be about maintaining global demand. And finally, the unleashing of currency markets and central bank coordination to suppress wages and discourage public investment. The collapse of Bretton Woods in the 1970s sets the stage for this sort of thing being dominant in the global economy in the 1990s. Now, the paradox of this order, I talked about the paradox again of freedom and sort of not freedom, but the creation of the neoliberal order, global order in the 1990s produced a whole set of new paradoxes, many of which are with us today and help one understand what is going on around us. First, and this was, I think, this had its echoes in the 19th century, but first, in the 1990s, in both domestic and international politics, market fundamentalist ideas that were initially associated with right-wing governments, Reagan, Thatcher, Pinochet, gained ascendancy in nominally left-wing governments and became associated with liberal social thought. As was true in the early 19th century, free market fundamentalism became attached to essentially humanistic ideas coming out of the Enlightenment. Racial equality, gender equality, equal and dignified treatment for LGBTQ people. Right? These two ideas, these two things kind of connected to each other. This is manifest in the politics, the Clinton administration, the Blair government, the Schroeder government in Germany, and transnational institutions like the EU, the OECD, and the World Economic Forum that push forward a mix of these two ideas, two sets of ideas. And again, at the heart of it are conceptions of freedom that may not necessarily be what is really going on. And then secondly, long-standing ideas in international relations, dating back to the early 19th century, took on new life as advocates of neoliberalism claimed that the combination of unregulated trade, the rule of law, and open borders were inseparable. Plenty of evidence to the contrary, but they argued they were inseparable, and that together they would produce peace and harmony. The reality, though, this was the ideology, the reality was something completely different. Key national actors in the neoliberal global economy did not play by those rules at all. The picture in the backdrop is Chinese workers, Chinese industrial workers at Honda in southern China on strike in 2010. Right? The representatives of the Chinese state are confronting them. This is not Davos values, but Davos values aren't really Davos values. And what this meant was that in the neoliberal system, some states' capacities grew while the rhetoric was that states were shrinking. China's state capacity grew, even as the Chinese state's percentage of the national economy shrank. The capacity of the state grew. And in some ways, very successfully from the perspective of Chinese society and the Chinese economy. Saudi Arabia, the Saudi Arabian state became a regional hegemon during this period. It did not weaken, it strengthened. In many respects, countries in the periphery of the neoliberal order, if they didn't want to be terribly exploited by countries at the center, had to strengthen their states. Those that didn't, those that took neoliberal rhetoric seriously, ended up very disadvantaged, particularly as the crisis of the neoliberal era intensified in the early 2000s. And speaking of neoliberalism as a global system, it was no accident that when the Chinese government, in response to things like this strike in the 2010s, before President Xi contemplated creating real labor laws, where did the opposition come from? It didn't come from Maoist ideologues. It came from the US Chamber of Commerce in China. Now that tells you all you need to know about the nature of the neoliberal global order. Now, where did the neoliberal order lead us after a decade of neoliberal hegemony in the 1990s globally? It created a feedback loop where in the countries where neoliberal policies were fully implemented, growing inequality and weakened states and weakened institutions of countervailing power, trade unions, civil society, led to nominally democratic political systems taking on the characteristics of plutocracies. Elections continued, newspapers kept being published, the appearances of democracy continued, but the actual power dynamics shifted more and more in favor of the wealthy and large corporations. And then their control of the state intensified it. That's the feedback loop. The feedback loop, the plutocratic feedback loop, resulted in neoliberal governments, neoliberal states, transferring key capital allocation mechanisms around the provision of public goods and household economic security from the state to private firms and capital markets. Education, retirement security, housing, healthcare, all moved toward the private sector and away from the public sector. And further vast fortunes were made in the process. Now, by the way, it's hard not to reflect on the fact that some of those kinds of processes were pioneered in the former Soviet Union and its satellite states in the aftermath of 1989, with, as we all know, ruinous consequences. In many of the world's leading economies, the state's political autonomy, the state's self-confidence, and its capacity for effective market shaping by 2000 has been weakened past the point of effectiveness by the combination of privatization, outsourcing. If you're interested in the outsourcing part of this, our colleagues Mariana Mazzucato and Rosie Collington have written a wonderful book about that, about the outsourcing of state function to consulting firms. Loss of revenue and mission constraints, formal and informal mission constraints. Now, before I finish talking about the global neoliberal order, it's very important to address what advocates of that order say about its outcomes. So I've been talking about its outcome in terms of state capacity and the integrity of democracy. And their response, not unlike some Stalinists talking about the Soviet Union, say in 1950, their response is, well, those things may be true. It may be true that, General Pinochet tortured musicians in order to achieve neoliberalism, but we produced economic growth. What do you say to that? It's important to actually have the data. And this is the data. This is global rates of economic growth from the World Bank, right, during the pre- and post-neoliberal order. Right? And it shows you something very, very telling. This chart begins in 1960. Global economic growth during the 1960s was between 4 and 6%, pretty steadily. And by the way, I couldn't get the chart that had this data had a lot of stuff on it, so I didn't use it. But that was true back to 1950. Right? The era of Keynesian hegemony was an era of 4 to 6% global economic growth. Now, part of that has to do with the post-war recovery of the world's largest economies, but not all of it. This is a period of extraordinary hope and optimism in Latin America, to some degree in Africa, and parts of Asia. but particularly in Latin America. The crisis of global Keynesianism in the 1970s, you see, produces this volatility that then follows. The neoliberal order takes over in the 1980s and 1990s and produces a more or less stable 2 to 4% growth rate. 2 to 4, not 4 to 6, 2 to 4. But it's kind of stable until it isn't. See, at 2000, you have the Asian financial crisis and then the dot-com bust and its global consequences in the United States. And then you see the real storm hit with the 2008 financial crash, which is a direct consequence of neoliberal doctrine. No less a critic of neoliberalism than Alan Greenspan said so. And then we have the very interesting COVID problem, which again is deeply intertwined with state capacity. This is not a record of economic superiority. It's a complicated record. There's things embedded in it. The extraordinary success of China economically is embedded in these numbers. But these are the global numbers. And they are not a story of economic superiority. And as we'll talk about next time, right, they do not have an answer to the neoliberals' order's inability to organize solutions to the pressing problems of our time. And so next week, when we gather again, we'll talk about the crisis of the neoliberal order. We've just talked about the construction of it. Next week, we'll talk about when it really runs into sort of its limits. In the first decade of the 21st century, which I find shockingly is now a long time ago, in the first decade of the 21st century, the consequences of the neoliberal global system were coming into focus through a series of escalating and interrelated crises. First, the 2001 financial crisis, largely in the equities markets, but then really the 2008 crisis. The climate crisis, rising inequality and the crisis of global demand, which is related, by the way, to the financial crisis. The resulting crisis of democracy and the rise of authoritarianism, racism, populism, some would say the return of fascism as a political force. COVID. These crises required and require today effective entrepreneurial states. Exactly the political and political economy structures that neoliberalism works so hard to destroy. And they've effectively, and again I give full credit here to Gary Gerstle, who lays this out in terms of American politics. They've effectively brought an end to neoliberal hegemony. And they've left in its place a world of rising conflict over what sort of political economy will replace neoliberalism. The fate of the planet, not the physical planet, which is indifferent to these things, but the fate of human civilization on the planet depends on what kind of outcome we get. And so next week, I'm going to talk about these crises in detail and about the alternatives facing us as a global civilization in the wake of the crisis of neoliberalism. And I will give it away to a certain extent that what I'm going to say is basically that we face, as we faced in the 1930s and 1940s, a choice between a democratic and an authoritarian future. Right? And with the looming threat of climate change above that choice.